Good morning. This is a story about one place and about one public square, but it could be a story about any place and any public square that represents the spirit and energy of a city and of its people. It's a story about the little things and the big things that nurture innovation and creativity and authenticity, and it's a warning about how we can lose a place if we don't pay attention to what makes it special. These are lessons that I learned when I was the past chair of the International Downtown Association, and they're lessons that I first learned when I was working on parks in New York City, one of which was the Bronx River, a neglected and disconnected ecological asset in the Bronx. And the small changes, it was a small thing that began the changes there, where an artist said that they wanted to float a golden ball down the river. Artists often help us think about and connect to and see things in different ways. And that's what's happened here. And it also happened to be the case that if you were going to float a ball down the river, you had to clear the debris and the cars and the trash from that river. So it took a decade, but bigger changes came from that little change, like the restoration of this concrete plant into a beautiful waterside park. It was done through a public-private partnership of many different community organizations working hand in hand with city government. Those were lessons that I took with me to the Times Square, perhaps the least natural place on the planet, which was named after this building, the New York Times headquarters in 1904, which was also the building from which they dropped the New Year's Eve ball, starting the New Year's Eve tradition. But by the 1970s, the beautiful theaters in the area, some of them, were housing the best porn in town. 42nd Street was the most dangerous street in America, and it was capitalism without any constraints, drug dealing, prostitution, and many of the problems that follow through that. So the solution of the city and state, the governor and the mayor were very happy here, was just to obliterate it, to make it clean and corporate. They wanted to create Times Square Center like Rockefeller Center, where everything looked the same. Two things stopped that vision, that big vision, from happening the way it was originally thought. Because people said, you're trying to save Times Square, but you're almost destroying Times Square. You're taking down the building after which the square was named and from which the New Year's Eve celebration happens. You're not protecting the historic theaters in the area from development pressure. And you're taking away, as you can see in this rendering, the lights and signs that represent the energy. So there was a downturn in the real estate market, but most importantly, civic groups said, we must keep one Times Square, after which Times Square is named. They said, we must keep and require that there be vibrant advertising on the buildings in Times Square. And the theatrical and Broadway community said, we have to have protections for the historical theaters before they get torn down, like this one was. So while that big project was shifted and became more sensitive and moved forward, there were small things that needed to be done on the ground. And so the organization that I ran for 20 years, the Times Square Alliance, initially the Times Square Bid, was created to take care of the little things, clean and safe and attractive on the ground. It meant uniformed but unarmed security officers that give people a sense of safety. It meant additional cleaning services on the streets. It meant new approaches to housing troubled people and homeless people in supportive housing. It meant bringing Broadway out into the public spaces of Times Square to bring energy and creativity, and rethinking the New Year's Eve celebration to make it a more vibrant television spectacle. So the combination of those little actions and the big actions brought life to Times Square. But now the new problem wasn't that you couldn't get through Times Square without getting mugged or killed. The problem was that you couldn't get through Times Square. The congestion wasn't on the streets, it was on the sidewalks. 68% of the people said that congestion, not crime, was the number one problem. 96% of the people said that they had to walk in the street because the sidewalks were so crowded. So we knew, because cities changed, Times Square had changed. We had a new set of problems, but that we also had a new set of possibilities. But how to discover that? Well, we tapped the creative community. We asked people in the advertising industry to say, what are the brand characteristics of this place? And they reminded us that at its best, Times Square represented what people love about cities and about New York. We asked historians who said Times Square has always been about news and crowds and sex and desire, and entertainment, and signs. So pay attention to that. And then we asked artists and architects and designers, and they said, be careful, don't have all the streets and everything down on the ground be uniform and the same. They said, we like the busyness, but choreograph the chaos. They said, think about the grand scale of the giant buildings, but also think about what's happening for the person walking down on the ground. And they reminded us that part of city life is not just passing through, but observing and watching the life of the city unfold. So by the time I started in 2002, we could move beyond the little things of clean and safe and fun, the little but essential things, to nurturing the essential characteristics of Times Square, its creativity, its energy, and its edge. So we began celebrating our design and architectural assets. We asked inviters like artists, as they did in the Bronx River, to help us see and imagine the public spaces of Times Square in new ways, even if it was fanciful. But nothing really changed until we focused and showed how a public space would change. And we started with this place, Duffy Square, and built beautiful red steps that transformed people's idea of public space. And as is noted here, that this space invents public space where there was none before. Here's a bit of what that looked like.
You know, sometimes New Yorkers take these steps for granted. You know, we do. But if you ask someone from elsewhere, they will say that this is pure New York City.
Times Square, the crossroads of the world. So much going on. But up until 10 years ago,
there was literally no place to sit in Times Square at all.
In 2000, the Theater Development Fund, now TDF, kicked off a design competition to rethink its TKTS booth in Times Square at Father Duffy Square, 47th and Broadway. It took a while, but the result was the Times Square Steps, which are celebrating their 10th anniversary. Times Square Alliance President Tim Tompkins says it completely transformed the way people think about the neighborhood and gave them a place to rest their weary legs before the pedestrian plazas and seating were installed.
For the first time, people could hang out and watch what we say is the second best show on Broadway, which is watching the amazing life of New York City and Times Square. The only skill is to connect it, not to support it.
Tompkins took me under the stairs for a behind-the-scenes look at the $19 million design wonder, entirely made and supported by glass. And its connection to Times Square?
They were steps that mimicked a Greek amphitheater, and of course is the theater district. And also, they had lights, and this is a place of lights and signs and advertising.
So the steps serve many purposes.
5 rows from the stage.
You could buy discount tickets to Broadway and off-Broadway shows, or just hang out watching the world go by. A spot for Jay-Z and Alicia Keys to shoot a video, a tribute to the greatest city in the world. And for Will Smith to hunt in a New York decimated by a plague and post-apocalyptic mutants in the movie I Am Legend. And hey,
1, 2, 3, there we go.
It's Broadway after all.
So the red steps changed things in a big way, but we had to go back to the little things. Months of fights with traffic engineers to get little changes in traffic patterns so that we could get a few more feet of sidewalk space in Times Square. And then a big idea under the auspices of Mayor Bloomberg and his visionary transportation commissioner, Jeanette Sada-Khan. A big idea done with a very little action. Just close off the street and we put out some chairs for people to sit in. Big idea, little action, huge change. Now, of course, some people said we were killing Times Square. Other people said that we were creating the best seats in Times Square. Yet other people created T-shirts celebrating the silly lawn chairs that we had put down in the middle of Times Square. But a year later, 76% of the people who lived in the area and 63% of the people who worked in the area said, yes, make the plazas permanent. And so with the help of the Norwegian design firm Snøhetta, the Bloomberg administration made the plazas permanent. And something shifted. Now, today and then, New Yorkers kind of don't like Times Square because they say it's for tourists. But you had a headline like this that says, could Times Square be a place where New Yorkers actually want to hang out? We had recaptured a little bit of what was there before. And the other dynamic that changed was the economy. This underperforming little piece, less than 1% of New York City, was now producing 10% of the economic activity in the city. And it was all because of these little and big changes with respect to public space. So then the question was, what do we do with this public space? And we knew that then and now, New Yorkers kind of feel like Times Square is for tourists, it's not really New York. So we said, let's bring the rest of the city to this public space. Our culture, our creativity, all of it in our city. And by culture, I mean the diverse cultures, diverse ethnic cultures of the city, the culture and arts life of the city, and also popular culture. We would do that through design, public art, markets, events, and celebrating our authentic assets. Design, like commissioning distinctive street furniture, tables and chairs of a higher quality. Design by inviting emerging architects every year in our annual Valentine's Love competition to create some version of a heart. And public art in every place, in every time, as often as possible in every media. Starting with our most distinctive assets, the big screens. We created the Midnight Moment, the world's largest and longest running digital art display that changes every month, but is shown every night at midnight. And we also partnered with museums far from the center of the city to bring them and their artists and their artwork to the center of Times Square. We tried with mixed success to get local food players to offer food in the plazas of Times Square. And while we paid attention to the big things, we also did the little things. There is nothing as transformative as having a single musician, unamplified sound, playing sound in the middle of a public space. It changes the atmosphere. And we did the big things. We had the opening night of the Metropolitan Opera broadcast in Times Square. And we did silly things like having yoga in the middle of Times Square. Because, let's be serious, anyone can find peace of mind at the base of Mount Fuji in an onsen. But try finding peace of mind in the middle of Times Square. You need yoga. So, and we celebrated as well what for us are old buildings, like 100-year-old buildings in Times Square. Here's what it looked like at its best. Celebrating New York in Times Square. Our city, our culture.
Love is in the air in the heart of Times Square.
When you think about Times Square, small businesses might not be the first thing that comes to mind.
The Times Square Steps, which are celebrating their 10th anniversary.
The Lot Radio has been streaming live from a Times Square storefront.
Free yoga and wellness activities at the crossroads of the world.
This year's celebration in New York was dedicated to the freedom of the press.
Thank you, Times Square Alliance, for dedicating the ball drop to journalists working around the world trying to hold the line.
This is what democracy looks like. This is what democracy looks like. To have Times Square turn into a food festival, I wish they would do this every month.
Times Square is the center of the world, in many senses of the word.
But it's okay. Behind me is the giant X that Suchi Reddy has created.
For me, this is a great place to express the love and the diversity that really this city is so proud of.
So Times Square still had its problems, but hundreds of thousands of people a day were coming there. Times Square was booming. And then it was not, and the whole world noticed. It was the COVID capital of the world. Sometimes our guys were the only people out there taking care of the space, but we stayed there because we knew, as it did, that the city would come back and Times Square would come back. The curtain rose up and the show went on, because cities always go on. Because the story isn't over yet. It never is for a city or a place. You know, Times Square still has challenges. There's things that are frustrating. Not all of our ambitions were realized. And that's the nature of things. You try, you experiment, you succeed, you fail. I am very encouraged by something that the new mayor has done. He's created something that very few cities have done, a new office of the director of public space, not just for Times Square, but for all the public spaces in New York City, which shows that he recognizes the importance of public space to the economic and cultural life of neighborhoods in the city. So that's very encouraging. But either way, Times Square will be fine because cities persevere because their people persevere. The same, you look at Tokyo, 1923 earthquake, 1945 bombings, economic cycles, ups and downs. Tokyo perseveres and survives because its people persevere and survive. Our role as caretakers of the city is to create the opportunity and the atmosphere and the conditions for everybody in their own way, all the people of the city, to be innovative and creative and contribute to the ongoing and ever-changing story of our cities, as messy and as unpredictable as that may be. So what did we learn during those first 20 years of big change and the subsequent 10 years? Curate and create great public spaces. Design it in a way that matches the spirit of the place and pay attention to the management of it. And program it in a way that's consistent, but also that captures the authenticity of that neighborhood where it is. Expect what's unexpected. This is a city. Know that things change. Take a chance. Pilot new programs. Try it out. And know that there's not a single answer. What works in Times Square may not work in Harlem, and it may be right for Tokyo, but it may not be. So know all of those things. Harness the private sector, the government sector, and the not-for-profit sector. Whatever you do, if they operate independently, you're going to have problems. If they're working together, you get so much more creativity and energy through public-private partnerships. And this is a very American thing, but know thyself and love thyself. Know what is authentic and distinctive about your place, and love it and nurture and celebrate it. And if people don't see it, bring in artists and creative people to help people look at the place in a new way or connect with it in a new way. Gather the facts and data that can reframe or change the narrative about the place. And keep in mind, start with the community, the shopkeepers and the people down on the ground who know the community. Take actions that are consistent, not a single one, but consistent over time, that are part of a coherent strategy of many different actions to affect a place. Make sure that you focus and are concentrated in one place at the beginning, because if you spread your resources too thin, you won't change something. And every step of the way, tap creative people, artists and architects and designers that can help you see and do things in new ways. And if you do those things, you will achieve a critical mass that changes a place. Jane Jacobs, the noted urbanist who wrote The Death and Life of Great American Cities, said, "Most city diversity is the creation of incredible numbers of different people and different private organizations with vastly differing ideas and purposes, planning and contriving outside of the formal framework of public action, of government action. The main responsibility of city planning and design should be to develop cities that are congenial places for this great range of unofficial plans, ideas, and opportunities to flourish." It's an idea that is in the title of a new book that I just started reading. It looks very interesting, Emergent Tokyo, that says, designing cities for spontaneity. Designing cities for spontaneity. I haven't read the book yet, but it looks really interesting. It's the same idea. Think about this Petri dish. You have different organisms in the laboratory in this dish. And when you're first exposed to an organism that is unfamiliar or foreign, you may get sick, you may become uncomfortable. But if you get through it like this child does, then your system is stronger and better prepared for the next unexpected thing that comes your way. And also, the organisms within that dish may mix in some new way that creates the cure for COVID or for cancer or for some new ill. Another metaphor, we need to create the space and the place for the jazz band, where each player plays their instrument in their own individual way, but they listen to and respond to the other players, and by trusting and harmonizing and coming together, they create the beautiful music of humanity in our beautiful city square. Or Yosanabe. Yosanabe, as you know, comes from the word yoseru, which means put together, and nabe, which is the Japanese word for pot. So we have to create the pot, the firm, comfortable, warm place for the ingredients to come together, and that it can withstand heat. But you don't just throw them in there and turn up the heat. You need the dashi, because the dashi allows those elements to exist individually, but also to taste better because of the way in which they mix together. But I still didn't really understand this idea of dashi, so I went to the Japanese newspaper in New York, and I went to the Japanese grocer 500 meters from where I live, and I saw the dashi aisle. So many forms of dashi, my God, so many forms. And of course it made sense. The mixer you use depends on what the ingredients are and what your intentions are. You would no more use the same dashi for every mix of ingredients than you would use the same tools to create and nurture a place in every single place. It has to be different. So, as placemakers, as city makers, as city chefs, this is our job, to create the pot, the strong, warm, clean, safe, welcoming place for the ingredients. And then to add in the dashi. But not just any dashi, the dashi that reflects the authentic characteristics and the special elements of, and the history of the neighborhood. And then, like that dish in the laboratory with the different organisms, like the jazz band, we, when we are paying attention and creating cities and public spaces, need to create the container or the place where all these different elements can mix and come together, each in their own way. When we do that, that's how we create and offer the opportunity for creativity and innovation and growth. That's how we find the cure for cancer. We create the beautiful music, and we create the delicious meal. And we create the great city. So, let us begin to prepare the feast. Thank you.